All right, thanks everybody for joining today's session on dual track agile for the enterprise. Today we've got Ian Armstrong here, who is a senior designer at Dell EMC. He'll be presenting some case studies from their own agile design processes there, sharing what works and what doesn't. And yeah, I'll turn this over to Ian and get this started.
All right, thanks, Jerry. Yeah, it's always a little weird doing webinars because I can't see any of you, so I'm just going to go ahead and present to my computer now. So yeah, as Jerry said, this is dual track agile for creative enterprise teams, and it's basically a long night of disruption and impossible deadlines because we all know that's how enterprise works. So my name is Ian Armstrong. As you may know, we recently completed one of the largest tech mergers in history. Change is an opportunity to grow, though. We've done a lot of both in the last, we merged in September. The newly formed Dell Digital Studio under my Senior Vice President, Nicola, has been working to transform our corner of the enterprise into a design thinking agency, which, as a lot of you may realize, is a huge challenge. We need to be capable of breaking the sort of entrenched paradigms that is in our large enterprises, and we want to deliver progressively more value to the end user. But when you've been doing things the old way for a couple of decades, say 20 years, that can be a really scary process. And I can tell you, when I joined EMC before the merger, most of my team had been there for like 12 to 16 years. And it was a really big risk that they took to try to turn their thinking. And we've done pretty good work the last year and a half. So when you throw in the already tricky problem of aligning a sales-driven company with an engineering-heavy culture, a global audience, and a bunch of creatives who don't consume agile or project management processes the same way as anyone else in the company, there are suddenly just days where crying in a corner and mumbling about velocity versus cadence seems preferable to taking your next set of calls. So, we persist, but the struggle is real. So today I want to talk to you about your creative delivery process. And specifically, we're going to talk about how to make that process and your engineering process all work together with stakeholders, and to do so with less friction about what's getting built. We also don't want to devolve it into a paint by numbers exercise that makes basically everyone on your team wish they worked at Facebook or Google. So we want to create value, not requirements, and that probably should have been a part of the Agile Manifesto. But as you know, from the title of my webinar, we're going to talk about dual track, and I'm definitely going to focus on the ideation side of things versus delivery. But the topic is more complex than, say, design for the backlog, deliver for the devs. It's useful, I think, to start with a quick review of design, user experience design, and the core ideas at the form of functional agile process. So design is the rendering of intent. And I learned this, I actually come out of advertising as my background. And when I took my first interest in marketing and advertising, I asked the head of the Academy of Arts advertising department why I should study his program instead of, say, learning computer graphics or photography or music production or some other discipline that didn't involve the occasional use of a suit and tie. He said something that really stuck with me, and he said, in most forms of art, the viewer's interpretation is what matters. So, let's be real here. If Jackson Pollock or Pablo Picasso walked into the room, they probably wouldn't give two craps about what you think their art means because it wasn't meant for you. But they're pleased you like it, and would you care to commission one? In design, though, the intended message is what matters. And by studying advertising, I realized I was pledging myself to a creative field where more than 80% of the viewers of my work would need to interpret its meaning with a high degree of fidelity to exactly what we came up with on the creative brief. The work would have to be on message, on target, measurable, predictable, and repeatable, but somehow not completely boring. And I've taken a lot of these lessons into my career in UX. So a lot of classes, and a few years later, I learned that the most powerful form of advertising didn't complete the circle of logic for the viewer. Instead, it gave them all the information they required to come around to the correct conclusion, which made the advertising message their idea. And having come up with that conclusion themselves, the idea then had real power. A lot of you will recognize this concept from the creative revolution of the 1970s, which, in a lot of ways forms the basis for what UX has become today. You'll also recognize it as the basis of a compelling user experience, and that's not a coincidence. We don't tell our visitors who they are, but rather we enable them to be more like themselves, and we try our best to make that a powerful feeling. The graphics, the code, the copy are all artifacts, deliverables, and they're the end result of many, many, many hours of hard work, blood, sweat, tears, pizza, and the occasional tequila. The process itself that gets us from actionable insight into a value proposition, though, that's the UX process. And UX needs to fit within the Agile framework preferred by most of the companies we work for today. So let's talk about Agile, since that's why we're all here. At the heart of Agile is the iterative loop. And I realize this is a review for a lot of you, but the idea is build, test, refine. The team mascot for Agile then would be Scrum, and Scrum has a lot of rules. You need a well-groomed product backlog, which requires you to have a decent idea of what you're going to build, even if you don't have all the details yet. And I mean, it's called the cone of uncertainty that we live within, not the cone of, I have no idea what and I can't even. So if we're being honest, that's where a lot of greenfield design starts from. Sometimes we get to redesign something that exists, but a lot of times we're designing something in the dark, and it's something new. So we'll get to a bit more on that. And so you need to properly estimate a sprint backlog. At the end of 2 weeks, you need to produce a theoretically shippable increment, emphasis on theoretically. And those rules don't always work well for creative teams because in a lot of cases, they were written in a way that supports engineers, which is a problem we can unpack with the help of Google, who through Google Ventures created the idea of the design sprint and dual track Agile. It was out there, but they really refined it. So Google has some comments on the premise of what's the promise versus the reality of life in an Agile unit. The promise is that you have an idea, you build the idea, you launch the idea, you measure it, test it, get results, iterate, and create a better idea. The reality that in this graphic is just so money is you start with a bad idea, and because you don't really know what you're building, it takes forever to do. At that point, especially in enterprise, your deadlines kick in because this thing's doing like 8 weeks and there's no going back. So you test what you built, if you have testing capacity at all, and you get inconclusive results. And so you just move on to the next shiny idea and build that in as well. And I swear this is how most products in the Silicon Valley are made, which might have something to do with their failure rate. So the promise is that teams are going to get that prioritized backlog of user stories. And this is where our story today really begins, because you then need to break that backlog into manageable chunks. And the reality is that design teams have long, frustrating sprint planning meetings because the backlog items are poorly defined. The chunks are supposed to get estimated, and producing them is supposed to reveal a team's velocity. Accurate completion dates can be inferred, but the reality is that we have slow velocity as well as poor design because the details are still being worked out during the sprint. The burn down chart is supposed to close down on zero as the team works through a known backlog, but the amount of waste and rework is incredibly high because the backlog items haven't been properly validated. This may be something you recognize. One of the most common complaints I get from designers under an Agile system, particularly under Scrum, is that when they're asked to write and estimate user stories, they say, well, I could write that user story, but if I could write it, I would have already designed the interface. So a sample user story may go something like, let's say, as an IT manager, I need to be able to log in and view my past network designs. As a developer, that makes sense because they can look at the prototype and say, okay, I see how that connects to the database. I see that this is how it's designed. You need the HTML, the CSS, the SQL code. Developers are very modular people, and as you add things, they're good at tacking new modules on and making them efficient and refactoring code. But to a designer, something like, I need to be able to log in, raises a few questions. Do I need to log in every time I visit the website? How can I minimize the number of interactions required to get relevant data if I'm forcing a login when it isn't axiomatic to a feature's functionality? Should we even subject regular visitors to a login? When do we ask for it? Can I accelerate it? How do we handle the registration loop? And what do we do if the user forgets the password? This is because we typically design Gestalt systems, not modular ones. Gestalt is a holistic system that's greater than the sum of its parts. You can't just take all the little pieces and say, that's my system. They all have to work together like an organism. A working UI isn't just the sum of its parts either. It's a Gestalt. So in other words, we aren't just building Frankenstein's monster here. We're building an ecosystem. The whole thing needs to hang together as part of a holistic end-to-end experience. So if all we do is bolt a bunch of features onto a page in isolation, we don't even need to test that result. We already know it's going to be terrible. So what looked like a small designer story is suddenly a full-blown whiteboarding session with a UX designer, an engineer, a product owner, and a visual designer. It may take days just to get all those people in the same room together and a couple of weeks to build and test it. So to recap, as an IT manager, I need to be able to log in and view my past network designs. Innocent story, maybe not so innocent after all. And then you remember that a stakeholder is literally anyone who can derail the train. And there are many, many stakeholders in an enterprise. So again, waste and the rework become the pain of the design cycle. And the struggle is real. So there's something else we need to talk about, or at least acknowledge before we can move into how dual track works. And that is simply that UX in its purest form is inherently waterfall, which is definitely not agile. It thrives on preparation. We want to know everything we can about the user. We want to know all the details of the business model. And only then do we have any hope of designing something that's ideal for both of them. There are several books on this. Unfortunately for UX, modern design is agile, and we need to make UX delivery work in an agile way. Unless you literally just crawled out from a rock where you've been living since 1992, this probably isn't new information. And I'm betting at least half of you have read Lean UX. And even though that's not the topic of today's webinar, it's probably a good place to start because it's related. And dual track agile can suffer from a lot of the same problems as Lean UX if you aren't careful. For example, building a solution for a problem that doesn't exist because you improperly validated your users. Common Lean UX problem. So it's a good place to start, especially if you haven't left the old rock house since Nirvana still smelled like Teen Spirit. But we're actually here to address the next problem in line after Lean UX. Oh, look, it's a cone of uncertainty. And in Agile, we say we live comfortably within the cone of uncertainty. And the thing about the cone of uncertainty is that while all the details aren't known, the general direction is supposed to be pretty clear. And since Captain Obvious is sponsoring this slide today, he asked me to remind you all of the takeaway. You can't design a system if you don't know what you're designing. That means knowing what the business goals are, who the users are, and how you intend to measure them. So the question before us today then is, how do we establish a generally valid design direction with enough clarity to fill a backlog? We don't need to know exactly where the story ends, but we need to know where north is. And our iteration, if we don't, will look more like a Jackson Pollock painting than a marketing message. And good luck measuring that for anything but a frame. Also, yes, my bachelor's degree is from an art school. Thank you for noticing. So we know about the delivery track, and generally speaking, it looks like Scrum. We could talk about the delivery track and whether to work in sprints or a continuous flow system like Kanban or how many weeks a sprint should be. But the thing is, we already know a whole lot about those choices, and there's probably 4 webinars on the topic this week if you look around. The delivery track is the meat and potatoes of Agile, and it's where we spend most of our time. It's familiar, and it's not where the best ideas come from. But Yoda's right here. There is another track. And it's one that product design teams use in their quest for the almighty minimum viable product. It's created several household names, and it goes by a lot of names as well. I like to call it the discovery track, and we really owe thanks to Google Ventures for defining it. At Google, the ideation or discovery track comes in 2 flavors, the research sprint and the design sprint. Now, a lot of you have read the book Sprint, and I'm betting at least a quarter of you have tried to run a design sprint. So for the other unspecified percentage of you, we need to review a purist approach to dual track Agile before we get into enterprise. So the lenses of human-centered design, first of all, were created by IDEO as a way to look at how to turn something like a business objective into a value proposition. We need to make sure that any features or products we design are 3 things: desirable, which means the users find them both useful and more effective than their current options. They need to be viable, which means the company is able to sustain the demands of the design team's output and manage the ongoing financial commitment to it. And they need to be feasible, which means they have to be designed in a way that's technically possible given the time constraints involved. And the question is, how do we get from a bunch of value propositions to an MVP? How do we generate the ideas, and not bad ones, that are truly desirable, feasible, and viable? So the discovery track is all about quickly generating a validated backlog of items. Research sprints focus on discovering a set of user needs and articulating them, whereas design sprints focus on creating a working prototype from the sprint research and the research sprint insights. Whereas the delivery track is all about generating releasable prototypes. Interaction designers, visual designers, copywriters, UX engineers refine those prototypes into production-ready assets. And the user testing in this case focuses on optimizing designs rather than validating disruptive ideas from the discovery track and the design sprint. The two types of discovery sprint, again, are research and design. We use the research sprint when we're short on user data. And we use the design sprint when we're ready to unpack the problem. And just a quick spoiler warning, the design sprint is way more work than the research sprint. So the research sprint articulates the problem and ensures the desirability and utility of the opportunity statement. When you aren't sure what you need to build and the goal is to surface the user needs around a business objective, that's when you do a research sprint. So it's a sprint model pioneered by Google Ventures, as we may have mentioned. The business needs are expressed by the product owner at a high level as a product proposal, but there are a lot of unknowns. We did this when I first joined EMC. We had to create an internal tool for salespeople called the Sales Resource Center. And because we didn't have a whole lot of user insight, we essentially took exactly what the stakeholders told us they wanted, and we interpreted the results and we built it and we tested it. And based on what we learned, we then went and actually designed our actual product. So the research sprint answers a lot of important questions about the proposed idea. Is there a market? Will the product help solve a problem? What should we build? Do people understand it? Will they find it useful? And will it be usable? And again, a lot of the complaints about both lean UX and the design sprint can be answered by properly researching something. So if you don't know and you have the time to do it, a research sprint is useful because it will tell you things like, am I solving a problem that actually exists, or am I solving a problem that I've decided exists because I think I know my user? So the research sprint has a few components. There's a set of questions and assumptions, an intentional and selective recruiting, a realistic prototype you can test, 5 one-on-one interviews combining broad discovery questions, and a real-time summarization of findings at the end of the sprint. The research sprint plan is pretty straightforward. You start recruiting participants, and at this point, the designer should start working on what we call the quick win prototype at Dell. And it, again, is purely based on stakeholder requirements. No matter how crazy they are, you build what they want. Then you schedule the participants, you draft the interview guide, you finalize the schedule. At this point, the quick win prototype should be almost complete. This is not high fidelity stuff, guys. Balsamiq would do if it had to. And if you've got a good wireframe library and UX pin, that'll do just fine. So this is a good time for the research and designers to review one another's work, because on day 4, you're going to put it in front of people and test and summarize the findings. And the idea is we didn't put a whole lot of ideation and iteration into the product. We literally just tested what we think we want to build in the absence of anything that we yet know. The design sprint is the more fun one. It's where we have enough information to unpack the problem statement and approach the solution from a bunch of different angles. When you have a solid set of business objectives, you have your behavioral personas, and you have the user needs available, that's when you run the design sprint. And design sprints are the bread and butter that powers Google Ventures, which is, as you know, one of the largest tech incubators ever created. And they're pretty fun and they're cool to run. And we'll handle the enterprise caveats a little later, because enterprise also makes a lot of things stop working. So in the design sprint, again pioneered by Google Ventures, the sprint is a 5-day process for answering critical business questions through design, prototyping, testing, and using actual customers to get feedback. Working together in that sprint, you can shortcut the endless debate cycle and compress months of time into a single week. Sounds crazy, but it actually works. And instead of waiting to launch a minimum viable product in order to get an idea of whether or not the product works, you'll get a pretty clear idea from a fairly real-ish prototype. The model here, and we'll talk about this in more detail, is what you see on your screen. If you've ever used Slack, Firefox, or Prudential Insurance, you've seen the result of a design sprint somewhere within that interface. The US Department of Defense literally used this thing to assess the value of life-saving technology, and they had some big hats up in that room. So just a reminder that you need decision makers, and important people have to get involved. Every team names the steps differently. If you read the sprint book, they're named differently. I like this set of steps because I feel like they're descriptive, but it's really the theme of the day that matters more than the title you give it. So on the Unpack Day, the ideal team is going to include reps from all the relevant functions and levels in your organization: sponsors, senior managers, marketers, designers, developers, customer service, sales, user support, remember, stakeholders, anyone who can derail the train. and all of those people can derail the train. Sketch day is what comes up next. How would you solve the problem? It's a pretty individual effort. If you've got everyone in the same room, you can do a lot of ideation and whiteboarding, and everyone, including the high-level managers and engineers, is supposed to come up with their own sort of detailed solution to parts of the problem. And one of the things that I didn't cover and unpack is as you're unpacking the design and the data, you'll actually draw out, you'll sketch out user paths that are most important to the product, and you can literally put boxes around the pieces that become features and tell people what to focus on. And so the day that you're deciding is when you review everyone's sketches and work out how the ideas may conflict with your objectives, abilities, resources. And the last part is to create some storyboards of your most workable ideas. So what you have is the sketch day is very blue sky. And the decide day is when you bring back in reality. And in the prototyping days where the work gets serious, you basically have one day to create a prototype. This is not easy to do, which we're going to get into that in a minute, because in an enterprise environment, it's a little hard to do that way. Researchers should be working the test plan, and then on the test day, you find out if you solve the problem. And yeah, we'll go over these again, and this is, again, the purest form of this thing. So, as usual, enterprise breaks everything good in the world. At Dell Digital, the main problem that I ran into with design sprints is that they're really designed for startups and small teams, the way the book is written. At a startup working on its first product, it's not nearly as difficult to get a bunch of decision makers right up at the CEO into the room for 5 days and gun out a new MVP. I mean, the team bleeds the product. They are focused and they want to be there. But anyone who's ever tried to explain to a senior vice president of a multi-billion-dollar corporation that you need 5 days of his or her undivided attention for the 37th project on their list of critical initiatives for this current fiscal quarter knows that the pure form of this thing is not happening, and it's not even close. So there's a saying in UX that designers and agile coaches use, but it basically loses everyone else, which makes for a terrible joke, but it's still useful in context. In enterprise, installing a new process isn't so much about turning the ship, it's about turning the iceberg. So the Titanic isn't going to turn in time. You're on the foredeck screaming, iceberg, and the engines are grinding backwards. The screws are turning up backwash, and basically everybody's about to be dead. And as the saying goes, ships don't turn fast enough to save themselves from icebergs. Neither do enterprises. So what we need is a way to redefine the iceberg, the problem, the design sprint, all of it, in a way that the ship's capable of understanding. So here are a few of the objectives that I faced when trying to run a design sprint in an enterprise. The stakeholders are busy people. They do not have time. Decision makers want a top-line summary. They don't want details, and they certainly don't want dirty hands about 95% of the time. Designers find it frustrating to have their ideation with stakeholders in the room who tend to be more grounded in their own perception of reality. And you don't get blue sky from reading a book of best practices. Businesses are execution focused, and they tend to have a get it done yesterday process model. And by the way, that attitude is what keeps your scrum master in a job, because they defend you from the tender mercies of a stakeholder whim. And so that isn't changing. Agile purists will tell you something like design sprints, they're just waterfall masquerading as agile. Well, that's not true. A design sprint is about aiming the cone of uncertainty. Design gives us the blessing of direction and not the mandate of a final decision, but you'll still hear it. They're intensely exhausting. They're totally worth it, and they save a ton of time in the end, but they really do put the lactic acid back in the term sprint. People don't tend to understand what the deliverable at the end of the week is supposed to be. I've gotten as far as sketch and decide day, and I've had a scrum master asking me, so what's the deliverable? And so there's a lot that has to be communicated there. People like to tell you what's impossible way before getting to the discuss and decide segment. But it is kind of cool to see what happens when you get past that. Modern enterprises are super virtualized. My last design sprint included 2 people in the UK, 1 on the East Coast, 2 of us in San Francisco in a teleconference office, and a graphic designer in Idaho. I can't even tell you where the other stakeholders were calling in from. I would have to check. But most importantly, there's often a profound lack of consistent user profile information across product teams, or having to help you entire subsidiary companies. So design sprints are hard. They're new and they can be really uncomfortable. But to borrow a line from my director, they're also the coolest things in pockets. If you need something like, say, to deliver the entire Dell EMC World virtual experience in under 8 weeks, and are expected by your new CEO to break online attendance records, which, by the way, is a real thing. And without a design sprint, it might as well have been what we call a resume generating event. So I'm guessing we can move on to some tips on how we did that. So there are 5 components that I want to talk about. Some are soft skills and others require hard measurements. But in my experience at Dell Digital, all of them are important. So we'll go through them real quick. Goal-directed design is an interaction design methodology created by Cooper that identifies goals and behaviors of users and the goals of the business and directly translates those into design. Cooper, by the way, also invented personas, which, as you know, are kind of a big deal. Even if Cooperian personas are a little fluffy compared to what came later, they were invented by the same person who came up with goal-directed design. Collaboration, you will hear about that, Grant. So again, human-centered design is a creative approach to problem solving, and it's the backbone of IDEO's design philosophy. It's a process that starts with the people you're designing for and ends with new solutions that are tailor-made to suit their needs. We went over the lenses earlier in this presentation. Key performance indicators are what make a design measurable, the old KPI. They should be based on real data and not guesswork. And if you have analytics, then you probably already use them. It's good to consider that in most cases, raw number sort of statistics and KPIs signal adoption, but percentages will signal a change in usability. So you want to be careful how you write them. For example, it's more useful to know that in the case of social media, they say a user who had 7 friends on a social network is more likely to be retained than it is to say you added 15,000 users in your new month or in your first month. The ones who added 7 friends are the most likely to be there a month later. So KPI measurements should be crafted in a way that matches the business goals and incremented and decimated in a way that, or decimated, sorry, in a way that allows for optimization versus vanity metrics. The UX brief, for which we're going to talk about in a minute, is borrowed directly from my agency experience and during my bachelor's program when I was in school. The UX brief essentially lays out all of the information the creative team needs in order to begin an ideation or design sprint in the most succinct way possible. And when you're trying to prepare and unpack, it's actually really useful to write one up. So finally, it's good to remember that conflicts between designers, stakeholders, and engineers are actually teaching points in the context of a design sprint. So just to give you a quick example, a stakeholder might misunderstand the intent of a feature, or a designer might feel limited by the stakeholder's vision. And as the 2 groups resolve their conflict, it's good to recognize that that conflict was probably going to happen anyway. The difference is that in a delivery sprint, they may have taken a week and a half to resolve instead of 20 minutes, because it's difficult to get all these people in one room, and then you end up with a whole sprint dedicated to changing their idea, the design based on the ideas and complaints that came up, and now you've lost 2 weeks. In a design sprint, it may be an intense debate, but you can knock that sucker out in 20 or 30 minutes, and that's done. It doesn't come up again. So what might be the most important point of all, though, is to let your people know what they're in for. While we try to limit the meeting hours required to for your primary team members in enterprise to as much as possible, they're still in for probably 8 to 10 hours of meetings over 5 days. And it's important to communicate that that's the case so they aren't surprised. And so make sure people are prepared for that reality and do your best to communicate how important their contribution to the success of the product is. So we can talk about my UX brief. And again, this comes out of my agency days, and it's something that I found really useful in doing the unpack. Bosky, yes, typically the design sprint would come after a research sprint. And if you have, like we do, a data science team on hand and you have a ton of information, you can usually get directly to an unpack by using one of these. But if you can't and you just have a stakeholder idea, you run a research sprint to validate the idea and make sure you're solving the right problem before you run a design sprint. It's all about your timelines. So there's a bunch of things that I like to throw on a UX brief. The business opportunity is a high-level view of the opportunity to problem statement. And again, it should be validated. That's the research sprint. It could also be so it could be either, and it should reference any supporting research. Here's the problem or the opportunity, and here's why we know that it exists. We ask what business objectives are going to capitalize on the opportunity. So there should be several objectives related to the opportunity, which should be actionable and have measurable goals. So if anytime you have an opportunity which is our reason for designing, there should be goals that we have the design's supposed to accomplish. That should be obvious. You'd be surprised how often it isn't done though. So there's a question of how we measure the objectives of conversions. That's the KPI thing we talked about. Conversion is the final action we want the user to take at the end of the funnel. It can be a product purchase, it could be initiating a live chat, it could be, I don't know, clicking an email link or downloading a document, or maybe even sharing a product data sheet. It could be a social media click. But we have objectives which we measure as conversions, and we turn those into KPIs. How do we want, how do we measure our success? Then we need to know, and this is the hard part, what are our primary user types and what do we know about their behaviors? And this is really where the unpack day tends to fall down. You want to briefly describe the main behavioral personas here and attach any detailed profile information to the document as separate pages. We'd like to know how and where the user is interacting with the product. That means, much like the user journey mapping that many of you've done. We want to identify the primary touch points, the environments where we expect the user to be interacting, while mobile devices make everywhere and on everything a tempting answer. It helps to define our primary use cases, such as, we expect 30% of the people to be mobile in a highly distracted environment. That's good to know if you are having to measure cognitive load on your page. So then finally, the budget, time, and platform constraints. You've got legacy systems to support, hard deadlines, platform restrictions, device types, software versions, design guidelines, design systems. All of that would go in the end. And it can often in an enterprise just be referenced out to a link that includes all that information. But if there's anything that's not already outlined, it should be in there. And so you'll find that once you actually develop out one of these UX briefs, that the result is you're fairly ready to unpack. By the way, back here on Planet Enterprise, I can't just ask a director to spend the next 40 hours of their life in a conference room. And if your company isn't literally swinging cash, you probably can't even get half your people in the same city. So certainly at Dell, we've had to make a few concessions to the gods of industry. The unpack in enterprise is not an all-day thing. I like to give it about 2.5 hours because there's a lot to uncover and there's a lot you discover you don't know. So in enterprise, it's the first day, and this is in the beginning especially going to be new to a lot of people. And as you ramp your design sprints, it will continue to be new to people, because as they get more popular, you're always going to have people in the room who haven't done it before. So you're going to want to try to keep people on topic as best you can, but you're going to want to give a little extra time for that experience. You're going to want to talk about the user and the stakeholders, and the stakeholders are going to keep naming feature requests or business goals. It's going to be amazing to you that as you get through the opportunity and goals and KPIs, you're going to try to go down to users, and some stakeholders are going to keep pulling you back up with business requirements. And in a sense, the experience of explaining, like, we need to understand in a broad sense who the user is. Sorry, apparently Siri thinks I'm talking to her. Where was I? So the experience of keeping the stakeholders on topic as you try to move through the user, because the stakeholder rarely understands the value of the full user profile until they've seen the power of it later. When you get the user defined, you move down to usually designing a few user flows, which are like little miniature journeys. And then when you ask things like, how does an IT manager working on an iPad trying to find customer service documents respond to this interface? Or are we meeting their specific needs? All of a sudden, what we know about the user becomes very important. But until you get there, the stakeholder is going to keep pulling back onto business objectives. They're very executional. So this whole exercise of keeping the unpack day on topic actually ends up being really useful later on when we get into explaining to stakeholders, for example, on our sketching and ideation day, that today we're blue sky and tomorrow we're not. And so it can be a very helpful exercise. Now, I like to start these things on a Wednesday because it lets the prototyping wrap the whole weekend plus a Monday. So you basically get your discussion day done on Friday, and then your designers have all weekend to think about things, and they can boost a few hours out of Saturday or Sunday if they need to. But you aren't going to know enough the first few times. Using a UX brief will definitely help, but you're going to get about halfway through the unpack and you're probably going to find out you know absolutely nothing about some things and way too much about other things. And that's just going to take a little bit of practice running them. And I'll give you a little anecdote about the first time that I tried to do this a little bit. Your sketch day is going to be a pretty individual effort, especially in enterprise. Remember, in the perfect world, we've got everyone in a room together. Out here in the real enterprise world, that's probably not going to happen. So I like to book a 1-hour meeting around mid-morning to sort of check in with everyone, hear some of their initial ideas, and help them ideate a little bit. And I like to refer back to the personas and the business goals and the UX brief and try to give a little love to the forgotten areas of the design. You'll find lots of people are going to give you the big user interface and give you the structure. And so it's useful to see some of those ideas first thing in the morning and then get a little bit more executional in the details and then let everyone go finish their sketching throughout the day. And do try to remind everyone that there are no bad ideas. And this is your chance to get really crazy in blue sky. Because it's actually, believe me, it's really fun to see how far out of the box your literally most conservative team members get once they have permission. When you suddenly free them of the chains that helps them keep their job every day, they've actually got some really cool ideas. So try to stay available on something like Slack. And as a facilitator, be ready to have a few more impromptu sessions on this day because people may have questions or comments or want some feedback from you. So discuss day is when the stakeholders all get to be cops, but now they're your friends, which I'll be honest, is a little weird. It's cool, but it's weird because you're used to arguing with these people, but now you've spent 2 days ideating and unpacking with them, and you started to establish some trust. You're actually becoming a team. And discuss day is how it really is the grind. We straight up booked 4 hours in a telepresence conference room for the last design sprint we did, and then we used 2 more in a standard WebEx call before we split up. So it ended up being a 6-hour day. And so again, this is the day when you take those lenses of human-centered design and every idea should be run through it. So the appropriate stakeholders are going to assess your viability. The engineers are going to assess feasibility. I just run it like a machine. If, as the UX person, I'm focused on whether it's desirable, and then I'll say, okay, stakeholder, is this something you can sustain if we do it? Okay, engineers, can you actually build this? What are our limitations? Okay, stakeholder, are we cool with those limitations? Me, do I think it still works for the user? You just go around those lenses and everyone feels like they have something to contribute in a very structured way. And so you come out of the day knowing really what you want to build or the direction of it. And then later on, you'll realize how much more awesome your stakeholder relationships have become because you've already worked through all the details and theories of why. So one of the tangible benefits of design in a design sprint is a near total alignment between stakeholders, engineers, and the design teams. And it's something that you don't really get to experience any other way. So prototyping day is when everyone but the design team gets the day off. And as I pointed out earlier, I actually like to set this up so that it hits on a Monday, and that way the design team has the whole weekend to let all the ideas sink in. Plus, they can boost a few hours from Saturday or Sunday if they feel like it's going to be too much work on Monday. Nobody likes to work weekends as designers. We know that on a tight timeline, it's reality when you have something like this. So keep in mind the prototype doesn't have to be high fidelity, just clickable. How clickable depends on whether you intend to do guided or unguided objective testing. And so at the studio, we use both InVision and UXPin, depending on our ability to lean on pre-authored object libraries or whether it's a totally new interface. So test day should, honestly, for you guys in enterprise, this should be the easy one because you have dedicated resources. If you're not in enterprise, thank you for joining. I'm amazed you're still here. But if you're in enterprise, then this is somewhere you should have resources. And really, you don't have a valid excuse to blow this one off because budget is like our one mega advantage in enterprise. We don't have to beg our we don't have to beg our investors for money to test. So line this one up before you even unpack. Know who you're going to test, know who you're going to do it with, and make sure you aren't stuck wondering what the heck to do with it on Tuesday morning when you have a prototype. A little bit of preparation in enterprise makes this one easy, guys. So having real user feedback will help guide the iterative process of the early delivery sprints. And presenting the final result isn't going to take that long. You'll probably need 30 to 45 minutes because nobody in the room is going to be surprised by the work. They'll have a little debate on the results and what they mean. But hey, we all built this thing together. Remember, one of the advantages here is alignment. So it ends up spawning this huge agile planning meeting later, since you can really now flesh out a validated backlog. And that was really the whole point. Now you can do a delivery sprint with a huge backlog of items, and you know exactly what you're building. And the delivery sprints become about optimization and improvement instead of, okay, what are we building? And that's really the beauty of this thing. So here's what's going to happen the first time you run this. And a spoiler warning, it won't be pretty. That screenshot is from a testing tool called Plunk, by the way. So the high level overview is going to happen fast. You're going to get right to that. Businesses know why they want to build something, and the product group that's asking you for something, that's making the request, they're going to have some pretty solid research into why they want it. And so you'll probably have way too many supporting goals. Like, trying to make the interface meet all of them, you're going to go, oh boy, okay, have we done that? There's going to be this checklist of like 15 goals. So this is different from startup land, where you have only a few supporting goals and a sort of very general high-level overview. Your product teams are going to load you up on that front end. You'll probably have a terrifying lack of user data because, again, enterprises, unless you're already in a design thinking org, you probably don't have data-driven personas and a data science team and ongoing research and ethnography into exactly who your user is and how they relate to a product, a scenario, or a sales cycle. Most of you are going to find there's a lot of really great information around the organization, and that's how we bring in, customer service and sales and anyone you can get to join you who might have that information. Bring them in for a week. Salespeople are hard; they have quotas to make, but if you can get them in, they know a lot about your customer. At that point, you're probably going to have to pause the unpack and commission user research if you didn't do a research sprint, which will completely blow up your first attempt. That's what happened to us. We got halfway through the unpack and realized we had, and part of this is because of the merger. We have the Dell customer and the EMC customer. One has an $800 purchase, one has an $800,000 purchase. One's transactional, the other is this sort of long tail. So we had no idea what to do with this. And it became a pain point. So we had to go back out and run some quick research. Bosky, we're sort of defining that now. I'll see if I can answer that question in the Q&A. So you might actually have the thing blow up if you don't know something. Don't lose heart. Go back, get the data you need and reschedule it. I mean, now that you know this, it probably won't happen to you. So you'll really have to tell me what the next iteration of OOPS looks like on the Product Tribe Slack. I'm on there all the time. Ian Armstrong, you can find me. I'm always happy to answer questions. And speaking of questions, we're just about 50 minutes in, so I saved you 10 minutes of your day. Now we can get to some of the Q&A.
Great, thanks, Ian. Yeah, that was fantastic. We definitely have some good questions here. So let's just get right into it. So while we're doing the Q&A, I will go ahead and run our poll here, and also remind everybody here that the conversation continues in the Product Tribe's Slack group, which of course both myself and Ian are a part of. And if you have more than 3 years of experience in a product team, we encourage you to apply. So here is the link to the Slack team, and let's dive straight into the questions here.
And I see several webinars worth of content in here.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we've got a lot of questions in here. So let's see. Let me dive into these questions. So I think this one is particularly relevant to just about anybody who's run a design sprint. I think they've probably faced this reality, which is, in your experience, has there been times when the same people just can't attend all the days of a design or a research sprint, and how do you sort of adapt to that when that happens?
Well, I try to minimize the number of meetings and hours that people have to commit. Look, I mean, you can't run a design sprint without decision makers and stakeholders. They have to be present. Some of your other resources, like on Unpack Day, you might get a bunch of sales and customer service people in to help unpack things like your user profile and to help with the learning. And they might not be able to make anything else. Some of them will think it's cool and they'll want to do it. But you get people in where you need them most. It's nice to have the stakeholders present sketches, and I find they actually kind of enjoy doing it. Even the engineers will present ideas that generate some good discussion. The stakeholders really need to be around at the discuss day. And one of the things that I had our Scrum Master do, and we had a long discussion about this, is at the end of sort of the sketching day, I had Martha check in with all of the designers and get some idea of what they built. We weren't saying, okay, your homework's due, where's your deliverable? Because certainly the designers wanted to work into the night, but she got a sense of the topics that people were going to cover and then checked again in the morning before our meeting. And that way she was able to organize them by theme. And if, for example, Diego, our social person, who's running a huge portion of the virtual Dell EMC World app that we're producing for Dell EMC World between May 8th and 11th, so that people who aren't actually there can see the keynotes. His social team has to run a lot of this thing. So basically everything that was attached to a social request, we made sure he was there to review all of that, so that if he did have to drop, which he did later on, he could at least drop for things that he wasn't the stakeholder on. So by continually checking in, and this is something your Scrum Master is going to be good at, and your Scrum Master is going to be asking, wait, what do I do during this thing? Well, a lot of what your Scrum Master is going to be doing is coordinating and sorting ideas and making sure that they help you facilitate the discussion in an orderly fashion. And your product owner is really going to be out there making sure that the stakeholders are attending at the right time and really sort of putting the pressure on them to be there if they're resistant. So use your existing agile roles. Your product owner can leverage the stakeholders, and your Scrum Master can help you organize. Don't try to do it alone.
Right. And let's see here. So now I think this is more of a research and planning question, which is, in your experience, how do you sort of juggle the designer's effort between discovery and delivery? What is sort of your criteria for deciding what projects should focus more on the discovery side of things versus the delivery side?
Well, my metric for that is actually really easy to remember. If you don't know what goes in your backlog, you need to run a design sprint. It's that simple. If you look at your backlog and you go, I don't really know what we need to build, run a design sprint. That's how you find out. If it's, and a lot of times it'll be something that, we have one other project that the timeline was too tight to do it. Everyone's in the middle of delivery on this virtual project. So we have another one that sort of had to get handed off to a different team, and they did not have time to do a design sprint. Would have been nice, but even though a design sprint typically saves you time, when your deadline is 2 weeks, you deliver old school. It's almost like the research sprint form. So really a design sprint is something where, as you design it, make sure that your timelines are far enough out in the future that after you get that definition on your product, that you've got time to actually build it. You'll have an ugly but working prototype. You're going to know the direction you're going in. Delivery is all about taking that direction and turning it into something highly functional and deliverable. That's the name. But anytime your backlog looks skimpy, you're not sure what you're doing, and you're sort of having debates with your stakeholder groups and your directors, that's a really good time to look at doing one of these discovery sprints.
Right. And this question is more about buy-in, which is, so in your experience, have you addressed or faced folks who have kind of this old school of thought, and they might think, oh, this design sprint or this research sprint sounds like it's just going to be a really expensive thing with a lot of people locked in a room for a long time. Do you ever have to kind of get people to buy in and overcome that perception?
Yes. Did you notice how many times I mentioned things like Google Ventures or companies that have been doing this, or the U.S. Department of Defense, or Firefox? Invoking successful companies that literally built their backlog using design sprints tends to go a long way with those people, because you can say, hey, the thing is, this isn't my idea, and it's not even a new idea. It's how the people we're trying to be more like, who are potentially more successful than we are in certain areas, it's how they're doing it. And I think that we can actually increase our profitability and our user satisfaction by following their lead, because it's working really well for them. Case studies go a long ways with those kinds of people, and they'll be willing to try it. If you've got someone who's thoroughly intractable, and I have worked with people like that before. Before my job at EMC, I actually did have a couple of clients like that. There's not much you can do. You can't run the full design sprint if someone doesn't want to do it. You can use the structure and sort of not tell people you're doing a design sprint and run the whole thing in phone calls. And then at the end of it, you can go, hey, by the way, we kind of just ran a design sprint, but it might take 2 or 3 weeks instead of 1. So you can still follow the steps and then tell people, oops, hey, look what you just did. And then you can compress it into a week. So there's a few ways to approach it.
Right. And pulling back here for a second. So when you work on that creative brief in the beginning of the process, are there any particular guidelines that you follow for defining the KPIs in terms of like how specific you get with those?
Yeah, that was the one that I saw there, and I went, wow, I could sit down with a couple other people and write an entire webinar on that topic.
Right.
The things I can tell you about KPIs are, don't be arbitrary and don't guess. Try to base it on numbers that you can find which are actionable. If you make your KPI, hey, we want hockey stick user adoption, guess what? Now you've got to do it, or you're considered a failure. KPIs are how you're measuring your success. So, for example, if we're running this virtual app up to Dell EMC World, we know how many viewers we had last year, and we know how many viewers Michael Dell would like us to have this year. And so our KPI becomes X number of viewers. And that's one of our success metrics. Now, in UX, as I said, a lot of times what defines success as far as UX KPIs is often in the percentages. And a lot of those things are difficult to measure if you don't have a system like, say, Mixpanel or Amplitude in place, because they really allow you to do these sort of user webbing and pathing and funneling measurements, where you can say, okay, so if somebody used feature X, then it predicts, feature Y with this Bayesian degree of accuracy. And then you can, as you get to know your app and you get to know other apps, you can start to write really complex KPIs and say, okay, well, if this app was able to do this here, we're going to put our baseline a little bit under that so that we have room to grow. Just be specific with them. And if you have no idea what your baseline is, don't write it as a KPI. Ask someone in analytics, look at a similar product, find something to reference, have a real number, or you're just going to you're either going to blow it out of the water by so much it's silly, or you're going to completely miss and look like an idiot. This is when you're in an enterprise, KPIs are how your design is measured. This is what says whether or not you are a successful design unit. So be careful with them, would be my guideline.
Gotcha. And let's see here. So interesting. So there's a question about the types of research that work within a research sprint. Is there a particular set of tactics that you found work well, or is it pretty much just open to whatever the company's case?
A lot of times in both research and design sprints, remember these are about, and I know I have a day that I call Decide Day where you decide what you're building, but design sprints are really about direction within the cone of uncertainty. They're not about a final decision or a mandate to do something specifically one way, and they're not set in stone. This isn't a design freeze when you're done. You're not producing exactly what you built. You're producing a better version of what you built. So the research on such a short timeline, it's not about oh, can we tree test this nav at Optimal Workshop? It's more like, I mean, if you want to use a research vendor, going to someone like User Testing or UserZoom and giving them a set of objectives and having them actually take those objectives and run some video tests, and then your researchers analyze the result and tell you whether or not your system is working. Are people getting confused by something? Do they understand how to get to the objectives? Are they getting lost when they open a flyout? Do they know how to close it? Things like that. This is why we have the clickable prototype. And you really only need 5 to 10 users to figure out where 90% of your problems are. The broader user testing is really for optimization when you get 40 and 50 testers, and that comes later when you're ready to deliver. When you're trying to find the things you might not have seen because of some small micro demographic. So stay broad. You're looking for more of a gut check than you are quantifiable results. You want to know what you're building works and that it's actually solving a problem that the user has.
Right. And I think we'll take the last question here, which will be sort of on planning the discovery and the design sprints. So would you advise against running, simultaneous, let's say like research and design sprints? Or
I'm not sure how you do it. I mean, I'm assuming you would need the same core team running both. So if you've ever tried to build a prototype in one day, that's hard. If you've ever tried to build 2 prototypes in a week and test both of them, you're going to be upgrading to something stronger than caffeine. So the research sprint informs the unpack for the design sprint. When you run the research sprint is when you go, boy, I'd sure like to run a design sprint because I'm not sure what I'm building. But if I had to unpack this right now, I don't know enough to unpack all the details. My stakeholders or my founder has asked me to build something that solves this problem, but I don't really know if we're solving the right problem or how the users are doing things right now. But I have all these sort of guidelines for what we should do. So that's where you just directly interpret what's being asked of you and run it by users and say, hey guys, is this useful? So it's really the research sprint is essentially informing the design sprint, where you can really look at the pain points and unpack what the user actually needs in relation to your goals. So it's and as I said, if you have a really strong core of research, you might not need the research sprint. If you try to sort of put that brief together, and that's what's so useful, if you try to put that brief together and you just go, I just don't know enough to unpack this for people from 7 corners of the enterprise and not embarrass myself, well, that's where you might want to think about the research sprint. So I'm not sure why you'd run the 2 at the same time. I don't see the use case for that.
Right. Gotcha. I think that's actually kind of closes out the session for everybody here. So thanks everyone for attending today. Ian, great job, and really useful information. And in closing, just to reiterate, if you guys want to continue the conversation and you have more than 3 years of experience on a product team, we encourage you to apply for the Product Tribe's Slack team, where both Ian and myself are a member of, and I've dropped the link in there again. Otherwise, thanks everybody for joining in on today's webinar, and we'll hope to see you in all the future sessions. Great job, Ian.
Yeah, you got it.
Cool. All right. Take care, everybody.
Jerry, there's a bunch more questions on here. Should I do text answers, or I'm happy to put these in your if you send me a copy of these, I can drop them into your Slack as well if you want.
Yeah. For these text questions, let me see here. I think what we might do is
the last question looks like somebody missed the start of my presentation, but I'm happy to answer it.
I think I can send you over the list of questions, and if you want to kind of answer them, we can drop them in the Slack team for folks that are curious.
Cool. I'll do my best to answer them.
Cool. All right.
All right.
Yep. Great. Thanks, everybody.
Take care, guys.